Hello. With Election Day looming, I want to turn our attention in these next couple of weeks to the various elections. And this week, as I said in my email to all of you, I'd like to focus on Congress and the elections for the House and the Senate. It's hard sometimes to keep our focus on them when so much is being written and said and so much tumultuous coverage is going on of the presidential election. But the congressional elections are very important. And I would like to take a couple of minutes here at the beginning just to sort of lay out why. I know that many of you will know this from courses in political science and government, or possibly even from high school. In the American system, Congress is divided into two houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives has 438 members, and they are allocated according to population. In other words, the biggest states have the largest number of members of Congress. And each year after the census, those allocations are adjusted. So in the last 20 years, as California, Texas, and Florida have gotten bigger, they have added more members to the House of Representatives. New York has lost a few, and other states have lost more. This is a census year, as you have probably read. The census is being conducted in some ways that are quite controversial, and the allocation of House seats really underlines how important the census is. We're going to talk about the census at a different point in this semester. But the point that I want to make is that the House of Representatives, is fundamentally a democratic institution where the states' votes reflect the size of the population. And that's democratic to my mind. The Senate is a very different creature. And I think that you can make the argument that the Senate is fundamentally undemocratic. The Senate is set up with each state having 2 senators for a total of 100 senators. What this means is that California, where the population is about 40 million, has 2 senators, and each senator more or less represents 20 million voters. In a small state like Wyoming, and Wyoming is the smallest state by population and actually has a lower population. The entire state of Wyoming has a lower population than Staten Island. Yet Wyoming also has 2 senators, each of them representing about 325,000 people. So 20 million versus 325,000. It's clearly something very undemocratic in my mind about that. Another example, and one where there is a very hotly contested Senate race this year, is my own Montana. Montana is one of the largest states in terms of area, ranked 4th, I think. And it has a smaller population than the Bronx, yet it has 2 senators, just like every other state does. Another way of expressing this, and this is not an original thought, is the current Senate makeup is 53 Republicans and 47 Democrats. That actually includes 2 independents who meet with and vote with the Democrats. But those 53 Republican senators who have a majority represent only 37% of the American population. So we actually have a minority government, powerful government institution, and it seems to me, I would make the argument that that is anti-democratic. The origins of this system, as many of you know, date from the formation of the United States, when the smaller, less populated colonies feared that they would be dominated by the larger, more populous ones, particularly by Virginia and New York. And so this arrangement was struck that created a two-pronged Congress one of which is based on population and the other in which everyone is equal. The ability to rule the House gives a party a lot of influence on legislation, particularly taxation. All taxation legislation has to originate in the House of Representatives. That's one of its very specific duties. The Senate has a number of enumerated powers. One is to confirm all presidential appointments. As you are no doubt aware, hearings are going on this week for a nomination to the Supreme Court of the United States. Ambassadors, members of the cabinet, and other high-ranking government officials are subject to confirmation by the Senate. Which party has a majority there is immensely important, because the majority party, right now the Republicans, have a majority number of members on every single committee. They have the chairmanship of each committee, and that means that the majority party can decide when to hold hearings, when to subpoena witnesses or information, and so on. When you have a president of one party and the Senate controlled by a different party, as has often been the case, the theory is that the Senate can be a check and balance on the power of the president. And of course, that's true. What's important in this election is, as I said, the Republicans have a margin of 53 to 47. And if the Democrats gain control, they will be able to either support President Biden or block a lot of activities by President Trump. So it's immensely important. From everything I've read, and there's an enormous amount of material on this, and the polling is actually updated just about every day at several different websites. It seems like the Democrats have a clear majority in the House of Representatives, and they will retain it. May grow a little, may be diminished a little, but there seems to be very little possibility that the Republicans will gain control of the House of Representatives. The Senate, on the other hand, is beginning to look like a very, very close race. And there are seven key states where I'd like you to be aware of what's going on, and I'd like you to follow the coverage this week as best you can. On some of them, you will find a great deal of coverage, like Maine, North Carolina, and South Carolina, and others like Montana and Iowa. You'll find less coverage in the eastern and the big national newspapers. Montana is particularly difficult because it has so few people. There's very little polling that goes on. And where in the big states like Pennsylvania and Virginia and the Carolinas, which are regarded as toss-up or battleground states, there are several polls a week. In Montana, we're lucky if we see one poll every 2 weeks. So it's hard to know exactly what is going on there. I'm not going to go through each of the races, but I wanted to mention a few. In Maine, the incumbent senator, Susan Collins, has been in office for many years. She positions herself as a centrist and has won re-election that way a number of times. She's now facing a very stiff race from an elected state official, and I don't want to rely on polling and say this will happen or that will happen, because we've all seen examples of polls that do not reflect last-minute shifts. But it's certain to say she's in a very challenging race, the tightest of her career. Two other interesting races are going on in North Carolina and South Carolina. But those are two other states that have incumbent Republicans. And here, too, the polling is showing that they are very close. The North Carolina race has been close for months. The South Carolina race has suddenly gotten quite close. And there is the Democratic challenger is Jamie Harrison, and the Republican incumbent is Lindsey Graham, who, as it happens, is chair of the Judiciary Committee and therefore chairing the Supreme Court hearings this week. Graham went from being a fierce critic of Donald Trump, the candidate, to a passionate follower of Donald Trump, the president. And he was regarded as a shoo-in for re-election, but Harrison has made great inroads, and the state is now looking like a toss-up. One fact that undoubtedly contributes to this is that the latest financial data released by the candidates shows that in the last financial quarter, Harrison raised $57 million in that one quarter. And that is the largest amount of money ever raised in one quarter by any candidate for the Senate. Money is important because it allows you to employ workers who can go door to door and hand out leaflets. It is probably more influential in terms of enabling you to buy vast amounts of advertising. So that's another race that's a real toss-up. And then another one on the East Coast is in Georgia. Georgia unusually is electing both senators this year because it had a resignation and a sort of a short-term governor appointee who is now running for re-election. And one of the Georgia Senate elections is definitely leaning Republican for the incumbent, but the other one is looking to be very close as well. This is very significant because, as I said, right now the Republicans have 53 seats and the Democrats can muster 47. So for the Democrats to take control of the Senate, they have to have a net gain of at least 3. And if President Trump wins another term, they need 4. The reason is that if there is a tie vote in the Senate, the vice president has the tie-breaking vote. So if there's a Republican president, the Democrats would need 51 votes to have a majority. If there's a Democratic president and they can rely on the vice president to vote with them, the Democrats would need only a pickup of 3. Adding to this arithmetic is there is one seat currently held by a Democrat, Alabama, that is almost certain to go to a Republican. And so that will offset the anticipated Democratic wins in other states. So we have these 4 East Coast states that I'd like you to keep an eye on, and those are Maine, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Michigan is another state where the election is maybe closer than anticipated. The incumbent is a Democrat. He's leading in the polls, but the various polls tell us this is still a hotly contested race that could go either way. Moving a bit further west, we come to Iowa. And Iowa has a Republican incumbent, Joni Ernst. She was regarded as a big favorite in this race, but the Democratic candidate has raised a lot of money and has run a solid campaign, and that race is now regarded as a toss-up as well. And then the other state that's regarded as a toss-up is Montana, where the incumbent Republican senator is being opposed by the current governor, who is a Democrat. And that race is very close as well. So those 7 states, Montana, Iowa, Michigan, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Maine, are the ones that are currently regarded as too close to call and very much in play. And so to take control, the Democrats have to have a pickup there of at least several seats. And we'll see what happens. If Biden is elected president, but the Republicans control the Senate, it will be very hard for Biden to get anything done. It will be very hard for him to get his cabinet approved. It will be very hard if openings arise on the Supreme Court to get them approved. As we saw in the last year of President Obama's term, the Senate Republicans, who held a majority, refused to consider his nominee for Supreme Court and just left that seat open for a year. So it's a very powerful demonstration of the power of the Senate. When you have a president and both houses of Congress controlled by the same party, it's often very easier to get things done, but not always. I mean, there was a period in Obama's first term when Democrats controlled both houses of Congress and the presidency, and they still had trouble getting through a lot of legislation. They were very slow with health care reform, for example, and Obamacare was not passed until President Obama's second term. So these elections are diverse in their nature. They come from states that have very different economies, have very different priorities. Some are very interested in international trade because of crops they grow or minerals they harvest or goods they manufacture. And others are less dependent on international trade and look mostly to the domestic markets. But I think that you have a range of candidates here of very different backgrounds, and there's a lot of interesting coverage going on. As I say, I do feel that unless I go on the web and watch television stations in Montana or read the Montana newspapers, it's very hard to stay on top of that race, though it's just important numerically as the ones in the Carolinas. So we'll see. I think it's a tumultuous few weeks. We are now on track to have one more presidential debate. The scheduled second one was canceled. The scheduled third one is at the end of October. We will see if the candidates can agree on how it will be held, and we'll see how it compares in tone and content to the tumultuous first one. But as much as we're fascinated by the presidential contest and it captures the headlines on almost a daily basis, I just don't want you to lose sight of the underpinnings of American government, and that is the Congress. I should also note, though I have less to say about this, that most state legislatures mimic the model of Congress in that they have an assembly and a house, though in some states they have different names. In New York State, we have a state senate, and then the lower house is called the Assembly, not the House of Representatives, but the Assembly. In Virginia, it's called the House of Delegates. The effect, though, is the same. The one striking exception to this rule is Nebraska. Nebraska is the only state in the United States where the state legislature is one house. So that's called a unicameral system, and it's only in Nebraska. All the other states have what's called a bicameral system, where there is an upper house and a lower house, and they have different parties. In the local elections, at this point, both the Assembly and the Senate in New York are controlled by Democrats. The Democrats have controlled the Assembly for many, many years, for decades. The Republicans controlled the Senate for quite a long time, until the last election, when the Democrats took control of the Senate. This is important to us because we live in this state, and it's particularly important to us as members of the CUNY community, because the vast majority of CUNY funding, more than 90% of CUNY funding, comes from New York State, not New York City. This is maybe not so well known, but the City University was created along with the State University of New York by New York State. And we are technically a New York State agency, not a New York City agency. Or to express that differently, my paycheck is signed by the state controller, not by the city. I will just mention here in passing that the community colleges that are part of CUNY are a different creature and are largely funded by New York City. But because the senior colleges of CUNY get their money from Albany, who is in government and what priority they make of higher education is very important to all of our well-beings. There's, well, I have to say I haven't read that much coverage of New York State elections. There's been a lot of coverage of the races for the House of Representatives because there's some new upstart insurgent candidates who in the primary elections in June knocked off some of the longtime veterans. And these are predominantly Democratic districts, so these insurgents are likely to be elected, and it would bring more diversity to the House of Representatives. Beyond that, there isn't, I think it's fair to say, there isn't a great deal of electoral interest in New York City elections. The mayor's election is not till next year. Various people are beginning to position themselves to run for mayor. But that's something we can talk about in another semester. So as you go forward, I know it's really hard not to be overwhelmed by all the news that's available. But for this week, and I think between now and Election Day, I'd really like you just to hone in on election coverage. Read and watch as much as you can. Make sure that you're looking at different sources. As I've said many times, if you're looking at CNN, look also at Fox News. Look at some of the major networks. Those are ABC, NBC, CBS. Look at least one of those. And if you're following the New York Times, please also look at other publications as well. And I think from that mixed diet, you will get a wide range of media coverage. And I think that to make intelligent choices, we really need all the information that we can digest. If you have any questions, please get in touch with me, and I look forward to continuing this conversation about the elections. Thank you.